Hello, everyone. Heather Prekop, Senior Director here at Euromonitor for Global CPG. I am here today with Erwin out of our Chicago office, Shane from our London office, to speak to the tobacco industry and what we heard at CAGNY last week and their builds on what they see from the industry today and future outlook. So I think just to start, we heard obviously from Altria and PMI last week and a couple pieces that were discussed. So to start off, I think just direct from one of the slides we saw from Altria, we heard on the outlook of the US nicotine industry. And it was that we believe heated tobacco will compromise 5% of the US nicotine space over the long term. So I guess leading with you, Erwin, would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think the message during Altria's presentation was really clear about how the nicotine market seems very resilient in the US, and they've been very focused on diversifying beyond combustion products into more diverse delivery mechanism, including nicotine pouches, but also heated tobacco products and e-vapor products. In heated tobacco products, the strategies will be centered around leveraging partnerships with other companies and targeting consumers who are looking for options that closely resemble the traditional cigarette consumer or experience. And beyond that, in nicotine pouches category, these efforts have been centered around increasing brand recognition and visibility in trade channels, but also connecting with the core demographic of the nicotine consumer. And finally, in the e-vapor market, I think the challenge has been the current illicit market landscape, now estimated to be around 90% of the total market. So there's a lot of things going on there that the company needs to address together with the government and other agencies to kind of like disentangle a little bit of the e-vapor market and be able to capture some of those growth opportunities. But overall, I think the idea is to try to move away faster and accelerate that transition to a combustion-free nicotine industry.
Great. Thank you, Erwin. Yes, that point on illicit trade, I think, is also valid in terms of challenges for future as well.
Yeah, I think so. And then if I can add from a PMI perspective, they're obviously the biggest global tobacco nicotine company, and they've really been leading the space as well in terms of that transformation piece that Erwin just referenced. It was a very positive briefing from them at the CAGNY event. Their non-combustible revenue is now at $15 billion US. About 40% of their total revenues come from non-combustible categories, and they're on track to raise that to about 2/3 of their revenue by 2030. I think what's really ominous, and they've obviously been really pushing in the heated tobacco space globally, I think what's really ominous for their peers and competitors is the fact that they're now assembling a kind of portfolio across all formats. You know, they've got presence with Zyn now in the nicotine pouch space that's grown about 800% in the last 5 years or so. They're also beginning to show traction with VEEV in the e-vapor space globally, and the capacity potentially for them to be able to migrate and manage consumers between those different formats with their strong brands means that they've got a lot of kind of accretive value growth that could happen moving forward as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. I think that moves then to our next question. What we saw, again, Altria kind of leading the question here, is looking at total addressable market. And so not just necessarily in the nicotine space, but looking at energy, at focus, stress relief, relax, were the pillars noted. And then with the launch of Proper Wild as a caffeine drink in the drink space from Altria. So maybe just speak a bit more about that expansion into need states. Maybe Shane, if you could lead there.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. I think there's a couple of different ways of looking at this. I sometimes talk about the role of nicotine traditionally, and if you look at the reasons why people have used nicotine going back many years, I mean, it's often for a lot of the reasons that you've just referenced there, or they're trying to address the need states you've just raised. So to some extent, you could see Altria's expansion into these areas as continuity. So in other words, looking to deliver similar moments for consumers just using different substances. Others look at it very, very differently and see it as expansion. It obviously is from a substance perspective, and they're moving into broader spaces where they see value moving forward. Again, particularly in the context of a nicotine and tobacco industry where you may have diminishing returns in terms of numbers of consumers, additional regulation, etc. I think the challenge for them, obviously, will be that the spaces they're moving into are very, very competitive spaces. There's a number of very well-established brands. bigger conglomerates and FMCG companies who know these areas extremely well and are able to provide products to consumers. So it's really up to a nicotine company like Altria, I think, to show that it has a USP, something unique that it can deliver to the consumer in these spaces beyond what the consumer is already getting. And I think, so the concept is a good one. I think it's obviously something that they need to do to look at in terms of an expanded addressable market for them. But I think the execution here will be key, and the execution is still the question mark, I think.
And just to add that from the nicotine perspective, I think it's interesting that some of that language is also, migrating to some of the nicotine brands themselves, like the example with On, where they were, signaling that, hey, this product is also for energy and focus. So consumers are also relating to that function of nicotine just beyond just traditional cigarettes or combustion products. So again, trying to use that need state very clearly in their elements and in their brands as well.
That's a really good point. And I think what was also notable is if you look at both of the presentations, both PMI and Altria had a section of the presentation that was talking about the perception of nicotine, what nicotine is as a substance, and trying to kind of recorrect some of the misperceptions that people have. Nicotine is not a carcinogenic, etc., and most people believe that. So this is something that myself and Erwin have been talking about for many years. Is that's really important for the future of the nicotine space, is that there's an accurate understanding of what nicotine is. And it was really interesting to see both of them kind of pushing on that at CAGNY last week as well.
Yeah, great. And then I think almost the flip side of that question is there are a lot of other drinks and food players entering into the cannabis space, and it's become, category blurring, if you will. But in both Altria and PMI's presentations last week, we did not hear the word cannabis, I think not even once. Thoughts on that?
I think there are a number of different reasons for that. I think in the case of Altria, they're a company, obviously, they've already made a big investment in the cannabis space that hasn't worked out well for them. So there may have been this may have been a very simple case of not wanting to draw attention to what they're already doing, which hasn't worked particularly well in the space. From a PMI perspective, I think probably they had enough to talk about in terms of what was going on in the nicotine space, and things are working well for them there, that they didn't feel the need to discuss that, although we do know that PMI are also looking at that area. They launched a product a couple of months ago in Canada, for example, in the medical cannabis space. So we know that there is stuff happening there, but it's still nascent. What has happened to date hasn't been entirely successful, so there's probably a certain hesitation, reluctance around that. Obviously, there's also a new administration in place in the US, which is the biggest market, and it's unclear what way regulations of the environment might go in that space yet. So I imagine companies are still waiting to see how big a part of their strategy for the next sort of 3 to 5 years cannabis will be. So yeah, I mean, I still fundamentally believe in the longer term that for a CPG company, cannabinoids can play a role in their portfolio. Certainly for tobacco and nicotine companies, if again you go back to that continuity of moment in terms of what tobacco and nicotine companies have always done, I think cannabis is a clear kind of line extension, if you want to put it that way, or occasion extension. But there are a lot of difficulties in the short term around where regulation is, around whether they've made the right investments up to date. And that sort of still needs to shake through, I think, in terms of where we'll see these companies in cannabis moving forward.
Great. And then I guess I think maybe last question, we obviously heard from Altria and PMI last week. Any other discussion points as relates to other players in the space globally?
I think in terms of the US market, and again, this was a topic that came in both presentations, in the illicit space, it's also a concern for the global market. And all of the companies in the space are very, very careful and very attent on what's going on with the illicit e-vapor and the regulation on e-vapor globally. So I think that's going to be a true line that we're going to hear from all of companies trying to understand what's the market's going to look like in the next 5 years, and I'm trying to understand how to work with regulators to make sure that the changes that get into place in terms of legislation are the best for consumers and not necessarily fuel for the illicit market long term. So I think that's going to be a concern for all major companies in this space in the next 5 years for sure.
A true industry-wide issue. Great. Thank you, Erwin.
Yeah, and I think one of the conversations we've been having recently is around illicit nicotine pouches. So, we've talked about illicit e-vapor and maybe, just beginning to get a handle on what's going on there. But there's another issue coming down the track, which is the more that category, the nicotine pouch category grows, the more regulation you're going to see in that space, and the more that becomes a target for newer entrants as well, and the black market grows. So, yeah, these are all very big problems for the industry moving forward over the next few years.
Great. Well, thank you both for your time, Erwin, Shane, and I stay tuned. I guess future blog posts in this space, or if subscribers passport within our tobacco and nicotine industries. And thanks again.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks.